Well, today on Crossing the Line, I have met a friend. His name is Charlie Meyer, and I'm going to tell you, now, I'll be honest, I haven't known Charlie very long, but boy, I sure do like him. We've just already met and talked a little bit, and I think you're really going to like him. I think you're going to have an appreciation for his story. So, Charlie, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Crossing the Line, my friend.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate the work you're doing here, and I'm humbled to be here with you.
Well, it certainly is an honor for us. Charlie, let's start off. Let's tell you what, let's do a big picture. You're an entrepreneur. You own a company. You live in Indianapolis. Is that right? What's the name of your, let's just jump right there for a sec. What's the name of your company?
We have a company called Threefold. It's a private equity style company that we basically invest in real estate and property services through trusted partnerships, and a couple of just really unique things. When I say private equity, I always like to qualify this a bit. We are, first of all, we're self-funded, so we don't raise dollars. For a big part, we don't want to be beholden to anybody else's expectations of the return on the capital, so we can make really long-term decisions. We're permanent capital, so we are not looking to buy a company and build it up and sell it. We're really looking to hold long-term. Again, lets us make really long-term decisions with our companies. And we do it through a partnership model where we have a minority shareholder that's the president, the entrepreneur in that business, and we invert the power structure and really just exist to support them and provide a climate of growth for them. And so that's kind of what we do.
Charlie, it's a bit different. That investment equity firm you have is different. It's different for a reason. And so we're going to pause that, and we're going to come back to that. We're going to go back now for a bit, because I want, you've heard from Charlie, and you've told us that this organization you have, while it has maybe a traditional name, it's not traditional in the way it does business. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason you do things differently, which is why we're talking today. So I'm pretty excited about that. So we're going to pause there. We'll get back there, and let's go learn about Charlie. So take me back to where were you born? Let's go back to a 6 or 7 year old. Who was Charlie, and where was he at that age in life?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in rural Ohio, in a little town called Morrow, Ohio, which is just north of Cincinnati. And if you're from the Midwest, I usually tell people a landmark there's an amusement park called Kings Island, just north of Cincinnati. And so it's out kind of near there. And I had a bit of an unconventional upbringing in that my grandparents were my main caregivers. And my mom and dad were divorced before I can have any memories. So I just remember living with my grandparents and my mom being there as well. But I always like to say, like, hey, my story is a little different, but it's not like a sad one. It's not like it was me in any way. Like I had a lot of love. I had a great stable environment that my grandparents provided. My mom and dad were still around. Just very different kind of setup in how I grew up. So in the first grade, we moved out to this Morrow area and lived on the corner of my great uncle's farm. So we had a little, 1 acre lot that we bought that we put a modular home on, and lived on the corner of this farm. So, which was a lot of fun because I had a lot of woods and just independence to explore as a young guy. And, but when I look back, we were pretty poor. Now I kind of understand that a bit better. We never felt like unstable, like I didn't know where a meal was going to come, not like that sort of thing.
Right.
But we certainly didn't have what I saw others around me, even in the little ecosphere of Morrow, Ohio. I did those differences. And like a couple of things that stand out to me is that my grandmother was a seamstress, and so she could make just about anything. And what would happen is that, there whatever the designer jeans back in, the early 80s were, we couldn't afford those. So what she would do is she would just mock them up and make my jeans for me. Right. Like that sort of thing. So I'd have something else, similar style or whatever. That was kind of the way we engaged, which was always a little bit, I knew the difference, right? It's we didn't have that, but that's kind of how it was. Or we had, just always had hand-me-down cars that were always just breaking down and that sort of thing.
Right.
And I remember that we had one that was so loud that when my grandpa would come to pick me up from basketball practice, you could hear it from outside the school. Like, so people would be like, hey, your ride's here, type of thing. And I remember that me saying like, hey, maybe you pick me up a little late, like just so that it's not like,
they don't hear that muffler or whatever.
Just stuff like that. And it's funny because I think back to that stuff, and I realized that it probably set an ambition in me a bit to want some other things out of my providing in life. And I think that as I think about that, I feel like that motivation was out of a bit of like maybe a negative place. Like it wasn't as like a positive motivator. So I've had to redeem some of that over my life a little bit. But certainly, I certainly was a motivated young guy to have a different opportunities, even though my grandparents did an amazing job. I mean, being so generous and sacrificial to provide me every opportunity. So it's not any sort of disparity back to them, but it's more, I look back and I realize, man, how I experienced that and what it set me on, I look back on now, and it led me some good places, but I wish I could have been a bit more mature about how I maybe thought about some of those things.
Well, we all can say that, right? But we look back in our lives, and you look back in your life, and times were different too. Even from where we are now. And I want you to think back, go back to that word that you said. I was pretty independent. Now think about what you did as a young child. Think about in the woods running, and then think about children today. I mean, things that I did growing up, I would be like, no, to my kid, no, you're not doing. You're going to do what? You're going to the creek? No. But tell me a little bit about what was a day like with Charlie out in the woods.
I mean, honestly, like I would disappear. I might be gone 6 hours, right?
Yeah.
Like leave with a BB gun and my survival knife, and leave off into the woods, and salamander fights and catching crawdaddies and things like that, like just exploring out on this, what felt like this vast, wilderness, right? Like that we could go and explore on this, or playing in the barn, or, just stuff like that when a friend would come over, that's what we would escape and go do and create forts. And I mean, I can remember, as a youngster riding my bike, 7 or 8 miles to my friend's house, right?
Yep.
Like that sort of thing. That is certainly different than what I think of today, but it also influences me because it's funny, my wife and I have had this conversation about like, man, we gotta let's be conscious of this, right? Like, what kind of independence do we want to give to I have a daughter that's 10. I have a son, and her name's Sabrina. I have a son who's 9. His name's Trey, and a son, Crosby, who's 6. And so a couple of years ago, we were thinking about this, about like, man, the things we did as a kid, like where could we give our kids like that sort of independence, right?
Right.
Like, what could we do? And I remember it was a big thing for like us to think about this, but we were like, okay, our kids were doing a little bit of like a golf lesson at a course that's connected to our neighborhood. We're just like, hey, we're going to just send them on their bikes. Like they're going to ride through the neighborhood over to this place, which isn't that far, but it's like, they were first and second graders type of thing. It's like, hey, you're going to go by yourself. And they thought that was the coolest thing ever. Right. Like, but it was like a stretch for us. And it was interesting to think back about that. Like, man, we were doing way more stuff.
Oh my goodness.
Back then. And we've got to keep finding these ways to stretch ourselves as parents, because it's not our kids' problem. It's our problem.
That's right.
So
I love what you said, stretch ourselves as parents. I think that's brilliant. We didn't think anything about it. The rule, maybe, you got to get home before dark, but, and I love, by the way, I got to take you back, Charlie. Thank you for saying crawdaddies. I haven't heard that in forever. Thank you for that. What fun we used to have with that in the creek and little crawdads. That's amazing. So you're out there, and that independence helped you to become who you are today. There's no doubt. But now let's move up a little bit, and you're a teenager. You're in your teens, you're in adolescence. What was life like for Charlie, and what was going on in your world at that point?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely been shaped by team sports. That was certainly something that was part of my life, and kind of basketball, football, kind of baseball sort of ways. But because we had, I wanted some things, right? Like that we couldn't normally afford. So I got a job at 14 was when I started kind of getting a job, going to work and being a busboy and a, dishwasher, the things I could find at an early age. And so I had to make some decisions kind of early on, like, hey, playing sports year round probably isn't going to work for me. I'm like, I'm going to need to decide. So I started to kind of whittle down like what sports I really wanted to play, and started to give up things like baseball, like I'm going to work so I can get through the summer, that sort of thing. And so I remember some of those decisions, like having to decide some of those things, which ultimately I don't think is a bad thing. It's just I remember deciding that. I remember I was shaped a lot by a church group that I was a part of, which was kind of interesting. I in school I would have been, it wasn't a big school, so it was, popular kid, in the, the sports circle, that sort of thing. But my friendship groups weren't really founded there. Like I didn't really connect with those folks as much as people at my church, which was at a slightly different community in Cincinnati there.
Interesting. Yeah.
It kind of pulled from more affluent areas. It was a bigger mix of kids. And I had a really unique opportunity in like 7th grade. There was a group there it's still around actually. It's called Mishpachah. And Mishpachah is Hebrew for the word family. And so it became like a performance group. Like it was it started off as a choir, and it turned into like this performance group that still puts on the same musical that was written, 20 years or no, way more than that. I'm way older than that. So 30 plus years.
Right.
We would travel basically the country and put this on for high schools and youth groups and stuff. And so that became a pretty foundational like friend group for me, and shaping to keep me out of trouble in some ways, but also kind of formed a different friendship group and relationship group that broadened kind of my viewpoint of what's available in life and different communities and that sort of thing. And so that was an interesting mix also with the sports thing, because I had to also make some priority decisions. Like I had a lead role in this thing as I got into high school, and what I remember having to decide like a commitment to this group and this mission of this group versus like, would I be willing to miss a varsity game to be part of the tour of this? Right. And I remember
Charlie
missing a varsity game, and that was not a popular decision, right? You can imagine from the school side of things.
Right.
And so, I just remember stuff like that. Like that was really shaping for me to have to, to think about that and then make some principled decisions about what was going to be important to me through that.
And while all this was going on, you were very active. You were in sports. You had this performance group that you were in. At the same time, you realized you had to work, and there was still work there that if you wanted extra income, right? So you're balancing a lot of balls even as a teenager. You're making decisions. You're making choices that probably helped your thought process even all the way up into adulthood, I would imagine.
Yeah. I'd just say that, as I look back though, I realize how small my perspective was. And I still kind of carry this with me today. I think I realize I probably have such a limited view of what I think I know and what I think, how it works, And I look back to then, man, I had like a microscopic view of like how you made money or how, what was possible to do. And so it's interesting to me to look back and see how that widened over time to land as an entrepreneur today, which isn't what I would have imagined back then, or even really had understanding that was possible, if that makes sense. So,
well, like all great leaders, you're committed to growing and learning and having a different perspective as you grow. That's amazing. So let's go. Oh, by the way, so you're in this performance group, and you said you had a lead role. Are we singing, Charlie? What are we doing? Are you a singer?
Yeah, singing, acting type of thing. That was a stretch, like to find that part of you, and be willing to do that. But it was a really cool, ministry. It was about kind of teen suicide and a lot of teen issues. So it was an edgy thing for a Christian group to kind of do, but it was really stretching. But some of my really core friendships came out of that. And when I think about like the butterfly effect, kind of that sort of idea really kind of intrigues me. Like when I think back to how this moment led to this moment that led to this
Yes.
moment, there's a lot. I mean, if that doesn't happen, like my life looks really different because the characters and the things that happen in my kind of timeline really base out of those relationships, and including my partner, my business partner of 2 years. So it's just interesting to think back to some of those early moments and where they lead you.
Wow, that is amazing, and you're beginning to create this timeline and already putting together the independence, the work ethic, the decisions that you had to make. So you're gaining all of these things as you go, and it's defining you. It is defining you. It's helping you to become who you are today. So now, what happened after high school? Was college in your future or not? What kind of decisions did you make around that? Now let's say we've graduated. What happens?
Yeah. Well, all through high school, I ended up dating a girl in this group that it was a year older than me. And so what that meant was that she went off to, and her family were big Purdue University kind of alumni folks. And so along that way, I got introduced to Purdue, and she was going there. And so I was like, I'll check that out. I would have never looked at that school. Just where I was in Ohio, I just would have not thought about that. But I ended up going to Purdue largely from the influence of being exposed to it through that relationship, and which was a great experience for me. I loved going to Purdue, but that was an out-of-state kind of move for me, and had to figure out a lot of financial aid stuff and all kinds of things to make that work, which is also a growth experience. But that was an amazing time for me to go to come out of a small pond into a very big pond.
Right.
And experience that, just the world differently through that. But, I really think back and I credit like that relationship and her family and stuff for, like, if I didn't have that, I'm just not sure I would have thought to broaden out that far. I just don't know that I would. I think I would have stayed, somewhere local, and it might've been fine, but it's just, I wouldn't have had that journey. And I think that's I don't know, that to me, like I think back to those things I gloss over. I don't really always think back to, man, if that didn't happen, things would be different.
I have a question for you, Charlie. Maybe you can help me out here. Purdue. Let's just for a second. We're going to chase one rabbit. We can get back to Charlie. I've never been able to decide what is a Boilermaker. I just don't know. Could you help solve this problem for me? I have no idea.
I don't know if I can either, but I'm pretty sure it's like it's some sort of worker around like trains of some sort.
Got it. Okay, a train worker. I get it. Okay, thank you. That makes a little sense. All right.
I don't know if that does justice. I probably it might be something you have to edit out of this, so I don't take as a Boilermaker.
Yeah, right. If it's not right. No, I love it. I love the fact that you took here you are again, taking a risk, even though you're following a girl, going to a totally different environment and a totally different landscape for Charlie. You're willing to do that, and you found the resources to go make that happen. So once again, here's another piece of evidence. As we look at your life, you're finding resources to do the things that you choose to do. You realize my choice comes with some consequences, and you're doing that, which is amazing. So you're at Purdue. You graduated from there, right?
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, I'll tell you, really, the story picks up inside of Purdue.
Okay, good.
I ended up getting in my junior year, like I ended up getting a packet in the mail from this organization called College Pro Painters, which basically is like, recruiting folks to run a painting business in the summertime as a college student. And this is a pretty pivotal point, because I think about like, if I hadn't been home to get this direct mail piece and I hadn't decided to call, like, and things look really different, because being an entrepreneur, I had seen friends and I'd seen other people do this, but in my mind, the way for me to kind of get to success in life was to go to college and get a good job for a big company or whatever, right? And that was the paradigm I was operating out of. And so this thing was like, okay, well, maybe I can make some money in the summer because I got credit card debt. I got all these things that like I'm to piece all this together, right?
Yeah.
So I end up saying yes to this and interviewing, getting the opportunity to do this. And I did that for 2 years in college, where you run a business. I mean, you do the marketing, the sales, the accounting, you hire the crews, you manage the finances, you do all the stuff. And it's a pretty short, it might be like 4-month window. You do all these things. And it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. And I had discovered some things along the way. I discovered, some of the things I was good at, some of the things I wasn't. The first year was really hard. And then I realized that when I decided to do it the second year, I was like, man, there were some things I'd do really different now that I've done this one time. And the second year was amazing. I was, where I wasn't working nearly as much. I was making way more money. And there were people, I had good people doing things. There was just like a lot of lessons out of that.
Wow.
That really changed. And that became that college pro. It became kind of a fraternity of sorts, like people that come through that. And it led to kind of our businesses after the fact. But coming out of college though, like I still had this, like, I was going to get a job, even though I'd done this, I'm like, I was learning this about myself, and I was like, but I ended up getting a really good job coming out of college for a company called Aldi Foods.
Yeah.
And what's kind of unique about Aldi, well, a couple of things. One is what I learned is they were like the 6th largest retailer in the world at the time. They're a very large grocer, but I didn't know anything about them, and I didn't want to work for a grocery store really. But they had an amazing starting pay and car and all the stuff that they offered, and when they recruited people. And so that drew me in, and a lot of responsibility coming out of school was really interesting. And so I got this job and coming in, and I was getting hired into the Chicagoland area. And another pivotal kind of moments was I got this job. I mean, it was great, man. It was early in my senior year. I get this job. I know where I'm gonna, be going, all this stuff. And kind of along the way, I started to think about the fact that I'm about to move to Chicago. My grandparents who raised me, right, are in Cincinnati.
Okay.
And they're getting older, right? Like
Yeah.
they're, 70-ish, and that sort of thing. I'm like, if I go to Chicago, like, it's just gonna be harder, right? It's gonna be harder to see them and stuff. And so I decide that I'm gonna write a letter, because it's back in the time when you wrote letters. I was gonna write a letter to the vice president that hired me, to see if they would consider transferring me to the Ohio division. And so I wrote kind of a heartfelt letter of like, hey, I'm coming no matter what. Like, this isn't an ultimatum, but here are the reasons why, if you would consider this, it would be great, right? And he called me a couple weeks later, and he said, he let me know that he arranged for that to happen.
Wow.
It's of no benefit to him because there's totally separate divisions, and he's sad to have lost me as a candidate, but he wanted to honor the request. And that changed everything, because as I got transferred to that division, my very first day, I met my business partner, who I knew loosely in high school through my relationships from these other high schools. He was a district manager in that division, and our kind of paths reunite in that. And which, I mean, honestly, if that doesn't happen, right, like again, life doesn't look like what it does right now. So.
Isn't that amazing, Charlie, that the decisions that you make continue to have these consequences? I mean, who would have thought? But you, once again, you had that leadership capacity to write the letter, to write a non-threatening but a heartfelt. You led with your heart right then. In that scenario, although you were going to be there, but you had, as a young man, you had the ability, the EQ, the emotional intelligence to say, let me write a letter from my heart and see if it has results. And then because of that, you met your business partner. Wow. That's amazing. All right. So here you are at Aldi now. Are you a division manager? Is that what you are?
Yeah. So they hire you in as a district manager.
Okay.
Yeah. And they want fresh kids because they want to teach their way, and that sort of thing. They don't want you to come in with the experience of, which is awesome, right? As a 22-year-old person or whatever, you're handed the keys to, here's 5 stores, and you got to manage adults and that sort of thing. So it was a lot, but it was really good, and it laid a foundation of a couple of things. One is I realized what I didn't want to do for the rest of my life in that job, and I'll tell you, I had going to Purdue. I always tell people there was 2 things I remember from going to Purdue. Like, I mean, it was great education, all those things, but the 2 things that were a piece of advice from guest lecturers, no less. but they were this, and it's really shaped some things for me. One is that there was the idea of like, you should live outside of the United States for at least a year, because you will get a perspective of the world you live in, right? Like, and I haven't been able to do that yet, but it has certainly influenced how we travel, how we take extended trips and try to do things to help widen our perspectives.
Yep.
It's really hard to be objective from the inside view, right? So that's carried with me, even though I haven't been able to do that part yet. The other thing is that this guy said, if you don't love what you're doing after 2 years, you should quit, because
Wow.
you'll be great at it.
Wow.
And I don't know why that stuck with me. I'm not even sure it's great advice, but it was like, for me, that resonated. And so as I was doing this job at Aldi, which was great in so many ways, and it had this path. They always showed you 4 years in advance, like what your salary was going to be every year, that you could just see, and so it kind of kept you, hooked in. And I realized, I don't love this job. This is a good job, but I don't love it. And I'm going to get trapped by this money. And I'm going to get trapped by like what's here. And I started to explore what else might be out there. And I had friends that from College Pro that had gone on to start. There was another franchise concept that the same group had. It was called CertaPro Painters. That was a professional painting franchise. And although I didn't know anything about painting really, other than running this business, that became like a pathway for me to start to explore, like, what would it look like for me to leave this and go do that? And one of the things that from college, again, I just didn't have perspective, but I remember doodling around and thinking like, man, if I had a business, I would want it to be kind of a consulting style business. Cause I'm a generalist. There's not one thing that I want to do
Right.
with my life. I'm not a practitioner of something. So I had this idea of like, maybe it could be like Meyer Management or something, where I had all these companies that I was interacting with somehow. And that was like I didn't have any other perspective than that. So as I started to think about maybe leaving this great job and going out and doing, an entrepreneurial move, I also looked at this my friend and who's now my business partner, and said, this guy's we get along great. We come at things from different places, but we're pointed at the same thing. And I think we'd be a really good complement to each other. It would be great to like build something together. And so that became my first big sales job, was to convince him, who wasn't looking for an entrepreneurial exit, that, hey, maybe it would be, we should do this together. And that kind of started us on a journey of exploring what a business could look like, and spending lots of time, once we made a decision that we would do this together, that we spent time in his parents' office, like, because they had a computer and we could write a business plan together. And we were going to buy this CertaPro Painters franchise in Indianapolis, because I knew a little bit about painting. It was something we were connected to from my College Pro days, and that'd be our starting spot. And so we did that. And what's interesting to me is that we got a lot of advice about like partnerships are bad, right? Like they just don't work in business. And we got a lot of counsel that we shouldn't do this together.
Wow.
And for us, what was interesting is one of the things that Aldi taught was to ask the next question. Okay. So you just don't stop there. You ask, well, why don't they work? Right. So that's what we started to begin to explore. Like, well, why don't they work? So we started talking to failed partnerships, and started to understand like what happened. And you start realizing that people get into business together in those relationships for a lot of wrong reasons, right? Like it's a straight financial relationship, or it's two people are trying to make decisions in the same space. Like you just start seeing like, okay, there's some patterns here. Let's think about how we set our relationship up that doesn't have that, right? So we're 24 and 25-year-old guys, trying to think about like, well, what's it look like for us to be, have a more of a marriage relationship, a covenant relationship, and we took some thinking from our Aldi days. We had stores in the same city, but we had distinct stores. We'd work together, but we had separate responsibilities, and that kind of led us to think about how would we make sure we always have separate, distinct roles, and we just trust each other in the decisions that we're making. And we would have kind of a mutual submission relationship, where if something's really important to Mark, right, like, and it's medium to me, like I'm going to submit to that, and we just kind of have that sort of relationship. And that became kind of how we forged forward. And so one of the things we did to start the business, I quit because he was on a 1.5 pay bands ahead of me. And I had a little bit of experience. So I quit, moved to Indianapolis, and we split his paycheck. So he literally sent me 50% of his paycheck every month, and he would come in on the weekends, and we started to build the business. And
Wow.
a year later, he came in and I trained him on what I knew about the residential side of that business. And then I moved over to the commercial side and started that. And so we just kind of kept this form of like,
Wow.
we're going to be in the same space, and we're going to be true partners in this. And that's kind of how we started.
Charlie, that is amazing. It really is beautiful. It's a great example of a partnership, of a relationship, of a covenant between two partners. It is. I love what you said. It just is so inspiring. You chose to submit to one another. You chose to allow. You may disagree, but that compromise of really, if it's something that the other person cares about, I'm gonna choose to compromise in this, and then the sacrifice that he made. Wow, sending you half his paycheck. I mean, what a great example of the success. And how long have you guys been in partnership together?
Yeah, 22 years. We started roughly 1999 is kind of when we kind of first launched the business, and so similar timeline to your training group there. So
yeah, absolutely. That's amazing, and I totally connect. I have a business partner as well. We've been together a long time, and I'm loving that you guys have been together, because it is going against the odds. It truly is, and you have to make those decisions. And it's just a great reminder for us all. So you're in this business, and I could talk with you all day, and we may have to come back, Charlie. This is so rich, but I want to move forward because I want to ask you some questions about your business that you're in. But let's, before we go there. So you met your wife, you fell in love, and you got married. Is that right? Was this while you were at Aldi? Did you get married at Aldi, or what?
My wife and we've been married for 14 years now. And so I met her actually at work. She came from one of our companies, and it wasn't one that I was running at the time, but my business partner hired her, and then we met kind of through that, and began to date and get married from that. So my business partner hired my wife. So
Charlie, you owe your business partner a lot. That greatest sales job you did is paying dividends for you, my friend. That's awesome. Well, congratulations on that. And congratulations on your 3, I know, just treasures in your life, and your children that you've mentioned earlier. And as a dad, and as a husband, and as an entrepreneur and leader, who you are is a combination of where you've been, and you are continuing to make great choices. Tell us a little bit about, why is it that your business that you're in right now, why is it that it's different from others who may have the same type of business, but yours is different? Tell me why.
It's a good question. I feel like, one of the things I always like to say is, like, we are kind of like a 20-year-old startup. I feel like our business kind of has evolved to this state, and now we've kind of claimed our identity. And as we move forward, so like, for example, like we started one business, and then, we started I went and started the next business. And then we kind of started figuring out, like, how do you scale? And we were team sports guys. So we just, how do you build a team? Let's bring other great people in. And then you realize you got to give them more and more responsibility. It's like, well, they could actually run this company. So why don't they run this company, and we do something? And it just kind of evolved, if you will. It wasn't as intentional as we are now. We can look back and we're like, hey, that's kind of working for us. Let's formalize that. And I think we were willing to have really long-term views of things. So we delayed gratification in lots of things, reinvested in our people a lot over the years, to continue to grow our teams and kind of build these businesses. And I think if we would have had a different mindset around that, we would have a very different business today. And I think one of the things that, with that, is that as we've empowered other people, has been a big focus for us. Is it's really about, like, how do we continue to give other people the resources and the environment and the things they need to be successful. That's just led to a collective success that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So I think there's some just mindsets of like that, of that nature, that has led us to become what we are right now. And now we're languaging that. We've languaged that, we've claimed it, and it's like, okay, what's the next 20 years look like, knowing what we know now? how we invite more people along on this journey. And that's kind of what we've been doing. So some of this, I feel like as we talk about it now, we talk about it pretty packaged. We can kind of, but it evolved over time through relationships and team building and delayed gratification and that mutual submission. How do we all kind of win together?
So I have to ask you this. So, as good as you are, there are times when you probably made a mistake in terms of hiring. There are times when things go wrong, or there are times when a team member, there just has to be some accountability, right? So when you have to have those hard conversations, all right, honest now, Charlie, who has that hard conversation? You or your partner, or both? Who tends to have those hard conversations when you have to hold a team member accountable, or maybe even set them free? How do you guys handle that?
Well, I'll tell you. So it's evolved over time, because like what ends up happening is that right now my business partner and I at Threefold, our immediate customer, if you will, or who we work with, is our partner that runs the brands. So we would never do anything inside of their business, is how we would look at it, even though we might own 90% of that company. The power structure is kind of inverted. So we would never kind of go into their company around them, but we would have engagement with them. So we have the way we have accountability with them is through lots of different one-on-ones and things. So we built a kind of a performance culture where it's kind of expected that you're having these conversations.
Love it.
We teach about having these kind of productive conflict and racing to conflict. That's been kind of part of how we've kind of grown up together in that way. That's true. It doesn't make it harder or less hard in things.
No,
we certainly screw it up all the time, but I think it's been a normalized part of like what you should expect in our business. And so that makes it a little bit easier for that to actually have an opportunity to happen. I'd say my business partner is really good at this. He's very direct and can really have those conversations well. I've learned from that, and I've grown in those areas. We certainly, if we make mistakes, we probably hold on to people too long. We probably have a heart of trying to influence and change things and that sort of stuff. We've made plenty of those mistakes, but now you start to once you start to have this momentum of culture and clarity on who you are and what you're about, it tends to attract things that complement that, and things stand out pretty quickly that don't match that. And so that's a benefit now of where we're at in the business stage.
Yeah, I can see that. I love what you said. We've created a culture of expectation. I love that. So, Charlie, as we turn this corner, and we have to close this time together, I want to pick your brain. There are aspiring young leaders just like you were who are listening to this podcast. There are others who are there that are just in a spot where they're saying, "Hey, what would you say? What kind of tips would you give me if I just some takeaways, Charlie, that you could help encourage these leaders as they're listening to you today? What would you say to them?"
A couple things I would say. Well, let me just start with this. I think that focusing on having a growth mindset is the thing you need to have. I feel like the idea that you're always going to be learning, that you find a way to help yourself do that, to be curious, to continue to ask questions, to not get fixed in your positions. I feel like that's a really important thing. You mentioned this earlier, and I would echo this, is that you got to realize that we're always in a state of becoming. And for me, the question is, are we being intentional with that truth? And so are you conscious of that? Are you thinking about that? A pastor friend of mine and just good friend, he would say, who are you becoming when you're doing what you're doing? Who are you becoming while you're doing what you're doing? And I love the consciousness that question requires, right? As you go through life. And because sometimes we don't pay attention, right? And we don't pay attention to the trajectory we're on. And, 1 to 2 degree shift in trajectory leads you someplace totally different. And I just would encourage people to be responsible with that and be intentional with that and stay conscious of those things. I think about, it makes me think of, there's a Matthew McConaughey, speech he gives, when he gets a Emmy at some point in his life. I don't know when this was, but what stands out for me about what he talked about, he was talking about somebody asking who his hero is. And his response is something around, it's himself in 10 years. And so
Right.
he's trying to figure out how to live into being his hero in 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of this growth mindset, being intentional, thinking about growth. In our company, we try to decode a couple things. One is that like, hey, leadership is not about management. It's not code word for management. So
That's right.
don't think about that like that way. Those are different things. And growing isn't about advancing. Like, so like you gotta kind of like, let's talk about what these things are independent, because you can grow wherever you are in whatever you're doing. And as a leader, right, like, that's about influence. And we want, for us, we're trying to attract people. And I think this is just good advice, right? You want people that want to grow themselves personally, that they have just a heart of service and an outward look, that they want to grow people around them regardless of position. We know that grows business, right? And so in general, and so we want that sort of relationship. So I just invite people to that just works for life. How do you grow yourself? How do you help others around you grow? That's a big part.
Charlie, you are incredible. I could listen to you. I'm learning from you. I hope we can get together and have coffee again. I hope you and I can have another meeting, and who knows, maybe even face to face, because you're so incredibly rich in what's important. And those are those characteristics those experiences that have made you who you are today. And wow, your company is just so inspiring. Thank you for sharing this. You've made a difference today. You've shared, and I know it's always difficult for great leaders to talk about themselves, but thank you for allowing us to have a peek inside of your life. And we want you to know, we here at Crossing the Line, the Eagle Center for Leadership, we're very just honored to have made a new friend. And I hope that we can get together again and talk some more, and maybe even I have all these questions in my head that I want to ask you. So we're going to have to follow up with this and have another conversation. But thank you for being on Crossing the Line today.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I like to say, I'm just one beggar telling another beggar where I found bread. That's a famous quote. And I feel like that's just true, right? Like, I've had a lot of people pour into me over time, and I'm happy to share those learnings. So.
Well, you sure have. Thank you, Charlie.
Appreciate it.